After reviewing the assets, your next step is to identify any threats that can do harm to the asset. Here are the most common threats companies face today. Based on recent surveys, a staggering 100% of companies experience a virus each year. Threats also include natural disasters such as tornadoes and hurricanes, which can cause major damage to equipment. Statistics such as these give a better idea of what threats specifically you should be focused on. The first step you want to take in identifying potential threats is to create a threat scenario. A threat scenario basically tells you how an asset, such as a server, can be compromised by one specific threat. Each asset can be compromised by a variety of threats, so you have to create a scenario for every threat that an asset faces. For example, you would have one threat scenario for a natural disaster destroying the database and another threat scenario for the theft of information in the database. Here's a good representation of assets which can give you help when creating threat scenarios. Each asset is ranked from least important to most important. Also, each asset is categorized by the most important security requirement of the asset. Each security requirement is then described in relationship to the asset. We can see that the customer database requires confidentiality versus the web server, which requires availability rather than confidentiality. It is more important for the customer database to be secure rather than it be available or broken. The opposite is true for the web server. Here's what a threat scenario might look like. First, you have the asset and its importance. Next, you would have the threat and a description of the threat. Then, the likelihood that the threat occurs. Here, we can see that the likelihood that a tornado destroys the client database is low. The important part is to focus on the risk score, which is calculated by multiplying the likelihood of a threat and the impact of the threat. To calculate the impact score, take the importance ranking of each area and multiply the impact the threat has on that area. Once you get a risk score, compare it to other threats to determine the most important risks the company faces. Another thing to note is in this example, we are using a scaling system that goes from 1 to 3. However, you can scale the risk score whichever way you want. Here is an example of a risk score being calculated on a different scale, using similar terminology. Once specific assets, threat scenarios, and their risk scores have been found, you can start working on risk control strategy, which is the way an organization addresses a risk. You usually have 4 options when addressing a risk. You can accept the risk, mitigate the risk, share the risk, or defer the risk. If you decide to accept the risk, it means you will not be taking any action to address the risk. Usually, this means that the risk has a very low impact on the organization. If you choose to mitigate the risk, it means you choose to minimize the risk in some form of countermeasure. In our example, this includes backup of the database to another location and a plan to restart the database when it goes down. If you decide to share the risk, it means you have chosen to get insurance in case the risk occurs. Both mitigation and risk sharing can be used simultaneously to protect the company. Lastly, you can defer or postpone the risk. This usually means that you need to learn more about the risk. Here's a chart explaining each of the 4 choices. The higher the likelihood of the risk, the more likely you are to mitigate the risk. If the impact of the risk is high, you will probably want to share or transfer the risk. If the likelihood and impact of the risk is low, that means you can accept the risk, and if you don't know much about the risk, you can transfer it or defer it, as it probably won't affect the company.